Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for February 1st, 2023. Many of you have been asking me about what is going on with Germany. Why did Germany give in to what was described as massive external pressure to agree to go along with the idea of sending the Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine? And Scholz had repeatedly said this would not happen, that he did not want to expand the conflict, and that especially given Germany's past, when Hitler's tanks had rolled across the Soviet Union, and the result was more than 27 million casualties, deaths of Soviet citizens, why would Germany do this? What's going on? And especially then you have the statement from the German Foreign Minister Baerbock that we are at war with Russia. So the question then is, what exactly is going on with Scholz? Now let's start with something that happened on January 30th, which was Scholz's visit to Brazil, where a proposal was made by the new Brazilian president, Lula, on the need for negotiations. At a joint press conference with Scholz, Lula put forward a proposal which he said he had discussed with Scholz and Macron. He said, first, we need a group of nations, quote, a club of people who want to achieve peace on the planet, unquote. Who is included in Lula's vision of this group of nations? Brazil, China, India, Indonesia. No US, no NATO. And he said that one of the things that has to be discussed is, why is there a war? Whether it is caused by NATO, the entry into the European Union, territorial questions, we must get to the bottom of this. And he said that while he acknowledged that the Russian operation, in his view, was a, quote, classic error, unquote, he also spoke about the lies that preceded the Iraq War, the lies about weapons of mass destruction. Now, the media lied on this because they said that he criticized Russia, but they did not include what he said about Iraq weapons of mass destruction and previous wars being based on lies. Now, that's a significant omission. But the second point is just as important. He refused to provide ammunition to Ukraine that could be used in conjunction with the Leopard 2 tanks. Scholz had come there to lobby him to provide this. And he said there will be no participation of Brazil in the war. Instead, we must seek peace. Now, this is very much along the lines of the proposal of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, who said that we must have a new strategic and development architecture. And she emphasized the importance of the nations of the Global South, the former non-aligned nations movement, as the core group which could lead this drive away from the Unipolar Order, which is collapsing, and the Ukraine war is a symptom of that collapse, the idea of trying to degrade Russia, which is playing a leading role in coordinating moves toward a different financial and development architecture away from the unipolar order. Now, to understand the German situation, I would encourage you to watch the video of the January 14th Schiller International event on the International Assassination Bureau. This will give you some real insights into what happened to German sovereignty. What we covered in that event was the targeting of US officials who were seeking peace, détente with the Soviet Union, an end to the Cold War, and an end to colonial wars. The assassinations of President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy as central to that. This idea of an end to the Cold War was a threat to those for whom the Cold War was the only acceptable way of dealing with the Soviet Union. Now, we also brought up the assassinations in Africa, including specifically that of Lumumba from the Congo. as well as the terror wave, the strategy of tension, which rippled through Europe during this period of the Cold War, including the attempted assassinations of Charles de Gaulle and the murder of Enrico Mattei of Italy, and then later in the late 70s of Aldo Moro, the Prime Minister of Italy. But the German situation is what I want to call your attention to right now. And for that, you have to see Helga Zepp-LaRouche's presentation on what happened to Germany, what was done to Germany in this period. And for the purposes of this discussion, we'll begin with the murder of Jürgen Ponto in 1977, the president of Dresdner Bank, or the chairman of Dresdner Bank. Ponto was looking at the idea that there had to be a shift in the international debt situation. This was a period of time in which there was extensive discussion internationally of Lyndon LaRouche's idea of replacing the International Monetary Fund with an international development bank, what later became the basis of his idea of a new Bretton Woods. Ponto had some interest in this proposal and this idea, and he was murdered, supposedly by Baader-Meinhof terrorists. A little more than a decade later, LaRouche forecast the fall of the Berlin Wall and laid out a perspective for a peaceful reconstruction of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And this was something which was also an idea of the president of Deutsche Bank, or the chairman of Deutsche Bank, Alfred Herrhausen. Herrhausen was involved in discussion after the fall of the Berlin Wall of what could be done to rebuild the Soviet economy, the Russian economy, using Western technology and capital, along with the taking advantage of the skilled labor force of Russia and a real rebuilding and integration of Russia into Europe. Herrhausen was murdered in November 1989. And that idea was put off the front burner. But it continued to be discussed by others, including Detlef Rohwedder, who was the chairman of the Treuhand, which was responsible for the selling off of East German industry. But also, Rohwedder's idea was, again, like Herrhausen, and like the proposal of the LaRouches, that Western technology be utilized to build these economies. After these assassinations, what was the economic policy? Well, what was the fight? The fight was between those from the Anglo-American sphere who posited the collapse of the Soviet Union as the time in which there would be a sole superpower and one economic model, which has morphed into what's called today the rules-based order. And this is essentially control by global banks and corporate cartels over all the world's resources and over all the world's economy, and an end to the idea of national sovereignty. Now, this took the form of shock therapy against Russia, looting Russia, taking away as much of the raw materials as possible, and industry and buildings and so on, just tearing down the country. And this led to a severe demographic crisis in Russia. At the same time, breaking the promise not to move NATO eastward and the continued eastward movement of NATO toward the Russian borders. Now, what Herrhausen and Rohwedder were looking toward instead, and the LaRouche policy, was an alternative pathway, a partnership for development. Herrhausen was also looking at debt relief for the poor nations. Again, going back to the ideas of LaRouche's International Development Bank. What Helga Zepp-LaRouche said in her speech is that these assassinations sent a clear signal to German leaders at the time and into the future. Don't dare to go with the sovereign program. Now, this is the same message that came from British geopolitics at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. No collaboration could be allowed between France, Germany, and Russia. there had been an idea of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, an integration of those three countries with the Eurasian continent as a sphere of economic development. This was seen by the British as an existential threat to control by the seas, the British sea power, and control of British finance over trade and investment. And so this was incorporated in the idea of geopolitics. You must divide Germany from France and Russia. And so the Triple Entente was the result of this. France and Britain in the Entente Cordiale, and then after the Russo-Japanese War, when Japan was funded by the British, the revolution of 1905 weakened Russia and ended up by 1907 with Russia joining France and Britain in the Triple Entente. And that set the basis for World War I. After World War I, you had the Versailles Agreement, which was crippling reparation payments for Germany. But at the same time, there was a sanction regime against the newly formed Soviet Union. And so you had two major countries, the Soviet Union and Germany, under control of Western sanctions, Western financial dictatorship, and a growing sense of despair. Now, this led to something that was extremely important. In 1922, on April 16th, 1922, the signing of a treaty in Rapallo, Italy, that was negotiated by Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister of Germany, and Checherin, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. And what it called for is peace and friendly relations to the two nations, and especially a cooperation on economic development. Again, the potential for deployment of German capital, German technology, German engineering to the Soviet Union that would be paid for by Soviet raw materials and a labor force, as well as a market in Russia. What happened was that this completely sabotaged the British post-war plans. And as a result, just 2 months later, on June 24th, 1922, the architect of Rapallo, Walter Rathenau, who was a scientist, who was a musician, who was a brilliant figure, was assassinated by a somewhat unknown German terrorist group. The same pattern as the post-Soviet collapse with the assassination of Herrhausen and Rohwedder. So if you look at this, you see that from 1900 to the present, there's been one continuous policy from the Anglo-American Empire, which is the containment of Germany and the pitting of these countries against each other. Now, this explains why there was no German response to the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines. This was a German-Russian policy of development, of being able to increase the amount of natural gas from Russia and energy from Russia for Germany. Instead, it was blown up after the West had promised repeatedly, Biden personally, Victoria Nuland, Boris Johnson, and others, that there would be no Nord Stream pipeline. Why did Germany not react? I think you have the answer from looking at this real history. And this is the same reason why Germany has been pulled in to NATO's war against Russia, using Ukraine as the battering ram. So this real history must become known, and it provides a basis for a new architecture. There's no reason for this kind of antagonism between Russia and Germany. And if you go back to the end of Rapallo, you see what happened. Germany was plunged into the Weimar hyperinflation, it accelerated in July 1922, right after the assassination of Rathenau. You had a full-scale breakdown of the German economy. You had almost a decade of chaos, which included accelerated left-right confrontation, Nazis fighting communists in the streets, an intersection between the left and the right in the terror operation, and eventually Anglo-American financial backing for putting Hitler into the chancellorship, including the Bush family and Harriman family bank from New York, and Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, brokering the deal. That's the legacy of geopolitics. And that's why Germany has submitted and given up its sovereignty, at least for the present, in the face of the ongoing desire of the Western forces, typified by NATO, the US, and the UK, to destroy Russia today as a potential alternative for a new development architecture. So thanks for joining me today. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.